Welcome to the Season 5 of the India Energy Hour podcast. This podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya J., Delhi-based energy and climate journalist, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, Washington-based energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you like our podcast, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the platform where you listen to our podcast. Your support will help us reach a larger audience. The consecutive G20 presidencies of Indonesia, 2022, India, 2023, Brazil, 2024, and South Africa, 2025, has resulted in 4 consecutive G20 presidencies held by emerging economies. This moment is hailed by many as a grand opportunity for Global South countries to make a push on different topics, including on energy transition and climate action. Collectively, in the climate and energy space, these countries have shown leadership on topics like Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, green development, climate finance and life, energy transition, and sustainable development, among others. Can they do more? How much more, and what are limits of G20 process? To understand how G20s work and how best can it be used for advocating for stronger energy and climate policies by Global South countries, we interviewed Dr. Prabhat Upadhyaya, G20 and Multilateral Advisor, African Climate Foundation. Prabhat is a leading climate and energy expert who has previously worked with G20 Secretariat in India and is currently in South Africa leading work on G20 in South Africa.
Welcome to the India Energy Hour, Prabhat. We are delighted to have you with us. This is a very special episode. We have turned 5. This is our season 5, and this is our first episode for this season. And we thought that let's start with something different, yet very much linked to what the India Energy Hour covers. We have talked before. You said that you are an avid listener. So happy to have a listener here, and also happy to have someone whose work we read and we learn so much from. So thank you again for joining us here. Looking forward to speaking with you in detail all what is there about G20, climate action, etc.
Thank you very much, Shreya. Thank you for having me on the show. Excited about this conversation, and thank you for giving the whole community a platform to share their stories and also where we are in these spaces. Looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so great, Prabhat. Let's just get started. As our tradition is that we actually start with the person, because we have so many students who hear this podcast, and climate energy is such a kind of wicked field where there's no one pathway that, okay, you do study this and then you study that and then you join climate energy kind of domain. People come from all kinds of backgrounds, from all kinds of interests, worldview. So would love to hear like your story. From where are you from? Like, what did you study? How did you get introduced to the space? What are your ambitions?
Sure. Thanks, Sandeep. I was making a joke with Sandeep, but that will remain off the record about this section of the podcast. So I grew up in a small town in North India, Kalka. A lot of your listeners might have heard of Kalka Shimla train. So I grew up in Kalka, and did my schooling from a school in that vicinity. Did my bachelor's from DAV College in Sector 10, Chandigarh. The first question, bachelor was in science with computer science, because ironically, I didn't want to study organic chemistry, which has everything to do with carbon. And now my life revolves around carbon. So to me, it's almost like carbon is paying me back that that you picked up a wrong enemy. So in my bachelor's, I swapped chemistry for computer science, and then there was I never wanted to do engineering. And that's why I went into the BSc. I heard one of your my colleague Shivani was on the podcast, and she also had the same feelings about engineering. So I'm glad that I'm not alone in that. And then once towards the end of my bachelor's, there's always this thing that you not have to go through the competitive exam. There was this thing suggestion that okay, look, you've done your bachelor with computer science. Why don't you go to MCA? And that is where I was headed to towards the end of second year of bachelor. But then it took a lot of time to think, reflect, and I felt that I just don't want to just be sitting just behind the machine and just doing coding, etc., and all that stuff. So so sat for the CAT exam in 2000. I think this is 2003. I think 2003. Yeah, if I'm correct. Yeah, and I remember that I messed up my mathematics section in that CAT exam, and I was cursing myself. But as soon as I got out, I heard the news that the paper had leaked, and then the whole CAT exam was cancelled that particular year. And I clearly remember that vision in standing in the bus coming back from college. I was thinking that that means that a lot of students and a lot of children will just let go of this exam, and there will be less competition. So I thought I have to double down on this particular thing and take it very seriously, because a lot was riding on that. And I, thankfully, I kept on it and scored very 90 plus percentile in my CAT exam. Not good enough to get a call from IIMs, but managed to get into the Indian Institute of Forestry Management, which I think has been one of the most consequential decisions that turned out in my favor. I was pretty young at that time, almost I think 20 years old. So it had and growing in a small town, my grasp on English was not that strong. So I didn't fare well in group discussions. And I'm mentioning this because you mentioned that there's a lot of college-going students in the audience. But I had done fairly well in the competitive exam and then in the interviews. So but so once I got into IFM, that was truly like a new world to me. Meeting people from different parts of the country, learning to know about the sustainability field as a whole, management also as a whole. It's just a simple exercise that after all of that, when I used to go back from Bhopal on holidays to my hometown, looking at a eucalyptus tree was a totally different experience, because you could see why eucalyptus trees are here. They don't originate in India. They're coming from Australia, but it's a production forestry and all that history would just play out in front of my eyes. So I think, it gave me a new set of eyes almost to look at my same surrounding. Fascinating insight into how trees and all that forests and all that stuff. And then as we had two organizational training, and I remember for the second organizational training, so I was very good at marketing management, and then I had to do a toss up that should I go for marketing management or climate? Should I be selling toothpaste and toothbrushes and all that stuff, or should I go into something more serious? And then and I was very good at marketing, but then I decided I'll get into the policy space, and I did an internship with A3 for 2 months, and that was very helpful. Unfortunately for me, this was quite early in this space, and so there were not many recruiters coming in to recruit us. And so I was left. I remember I and one more of my colleague, after the end of the placement week in the batch of 45 students, two were the only one without any job. So we were giving our midterm exam without an offer in our hand, and we were just wondering what have we done with our life so far. But we did get placed. And the place where I went to, I wouldn't mention, but I was definitely not happy in that place. And I somehow got hold of a book by Jim Collins. It's a management book called Good to Great. And while reading that book, it gives a very interesting analogy. It says that, in your career, you need to see if you're on the correct bus, which is taking towards your destination, and whether once you have sorted that out, you need to see whether you're on the right seat, the kind of seat you want to be, whether you're on a driver or passenger or conductor or whosoever. And that book made me realize I was on a wrong bus. And within 3 months, I changed my job, joined Eco Securities. This was in the carbon credits business, CDM consulting for 1 year. Moved from place where I was to Jaipur for a year. Made friends, learned about this whole new field. But then within a year, moved to TERI, the Energy Resources Institute, and that was, I think, a big exposure for me from that point on. I got exposed to the policy realm in the practical terms. I had a huge opportunity to work with Ambassador Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, who who was a giant in our field. Unfortunately, he passed away 2 years back. And Dr. Pradipta Ghosh, who were around 2008, 2009, they were leading the Indian delegation for the climate negotiations. This is on COP15 Copenhagen. So got exposure to that whole set, and that kind of trained me from a negotiations perspective. After TERI, I went on a Humboldt Fellowship to Germany for a year, which gave me insight into how developed countries look into this issue. Came back, worked for a year and a half with Center for Policy Research with Professor Navroz Dubash, and I think that just strengthened my research skills significantly. Had an opportunity to write 1 or 2 papers with him, which one of them was termed as the top 20 influential articles by climate policy for its first 20 years. So that was a big moment of recognition that we can, that I belong here. Don't have to worry about this thing anymore. And then 2013, I again moved to Sweden for my PhD, which incidentally was on climate policy processes and international national dynamics in India, Brazil, South Africa. Post that, moved to South Africa for 4.5 years after my PhD with WWF. So from think tank, the consulting to think tank to academia to NGO, and then there was this. I was looking for a change in 2022, and there's this position of senior policy specialist at India's G20 secretariat was advertised. I applied for it with half a minute left to push the submit button, and got shortlisted for interview, etc., and made it through to the secretariat. And then it was again, a whole new world opened up in front of my eyes, that what we read, what we try to influence, and how actually things happen on the ground. So that happened, and then once that ended, I of course needed some time to breathe a bit, and then I reached out to the African Climate Foundation, because so my wife is South African, so that's the reason why I keep coming back to South Africa, try to find a way to navigate these two spaces. And had a discussion on the G20 coming in. So this was discussion which I had at the beginning of last year, and so by April I started working on this thing. And now 9 months, 10 months down the line, we are in a position where we are sort of the go-to organization in terms of organization which not only knows about South Africa and Africa as a whole, but also understands that how G20 will play out. So some of the stories that taking the path less traveled does definitely give you an edge. Yeah. So I think that's professional.
That's a very comprehensive journey, I would say, from a small town in Himachal all the way to now South Africa, working on G20. It's a long and very fantastic and fascinating journey. There's a lot of things that are quite intriguing. But one thing that I'm curious is, like, there's so many transitions that you made, right? Your own transition, like the energy transition from a marketing person to a climate person to a policy, then within policy, certain now G20. Like, do you find these transitions? I mean, everybody, you probably find it challenging, but what excites you about them, or these different transitions that you make? Would you want to be that one person who does like one thing very well for 30 years, or like 30 things, not 30, but 10, 15 things over 30 years? So yeah, just curious, like it just speaks to the larger professional trajectory of people.
Yeah, I think you can compare it to, say, there are different actors in, say, movie industries which repeat the same kind of roles, right? They're known for those kind of roles, and they make a lot of money with that. But then there are those who like to experiment, who like to push the envelope, and who like to explore that, what are the limits to which you can go. Can you do this thing? Can you do that thing? And I think I find myself, I'm probably the latter, and that's probably why I used to like the actors who used to not get typecast in a certain kind of one role. But I think that the common thread in my career has been the climate space, right? That I kept one foot very stable, that I want to work on climate. I may have worn different hats, but they all are climate linked. You do need a certain degree of stability even if you're transitioning, so that you don't fall flat on your face. And I think that finding that balance, that having a stable anchor, that this is what I want to be known. So, for example, while I was at WWF, I was leading the regional policy advocacy on plastics, on when in the run up to the UNEP process on the plastic negotiations, and I enjoyed that process. But then, after a point, I was like, no, I want to get back to climate and energy space. So but that experience helped me in understanding the multilateral process, but also the African. So what the transitions and being in different places, what it makes show is that you are not in your comfort zone, and any growth happens outside of your comfort zone. So it might not be expertise in one specific area, but the coverage and the width of topics, and then the capacity one develops to find interlinkages, find the linkages, that enhances. And I think as we are staring at the advent of artificial intelligence, or we are getting into these things, these are the things, the possibility, the imagination that you bring in to see the connections between varied field, that will hold people in strong stead than just pure expertise on one thing, unless you are a doctor or specializing in something and saving lives literally, I think.
I really like the comparison you made of yourself with a movie star. Good to have a method actor here with us. But it looks like currently G20 is the script that you're working on for some years. And before we get into the nuances of it, let's just, very quickly get into what is G20, how does it work, why it is important. There are so many multilateral platforms across. There's ASEAN, there is G7. Then this G20 kind of has attracted more attention, maybe because we are sitting in this part of the world probably. So if you can juxtaposition it and also tell us what kind of importance does it hold in the global dialogue over a variety of issues.
Sure. So I think from international politics, international relations, there is you have bilateral relations, you have trilateral, like three parties, two parties. You have multilateral, where the whole UN system is multilateral, like multiple number of countries involved, and then there is something called minilateral, like you have more than two or three organizations, but it's still manageable number. So G20 would possibly fall in something of that sort, where you have 2021 odd organizations which come together to discuss things. Now, the major difference between, say, G20, BRICS, ASEAN, G7 is, with ASEAN, there is a common thread, Asia, like Southeast Asia. With G7, developed countries, BRICS, emerging economies. G20 in current time becomes important because it's one of those few, I think probably one of the of its kind platform, which brings two different set of organizations together face to face, developed countries and developing countries, so that they are not discussing things in echo chambers. So it creates a platform to break those echo chambers, and they have to come together to discuss, debate, argue, and eventually reach consensus on things, howsoever weak, on matters, on issues of global governance. So in that sense, it becomes very important. And over so G20 started after, I think, 96, 97, after Asian financial crisis. Around 2008, after the financial crisis in 2008, it was, so up until that time, the first decade, it was limited to finance track only, so finance ministries, etc. But and national banks, etc. Then uh, the 2008, after the 2008 financial crisis, it was elevated to the leaders level. And that's where, I think, if I remember correctly, in Heligandum, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh made an important announcement at that time, that India's emissions will always remain below the per capita level of developed countries, something to that effect. You know, but that was kind of indicating, throwing the gauntlet at developed countries, that if you really want us to act, then why don't you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions significantly? And over time, so it has grown in importance, uh, and because it has been in emerging economies now for last 3 4 years, Indonesia, India, it has become prominent in our psyche. Also, I mean, the for India, for us, as stated by the foreign minister, G20 was a way for India to get ready for the world, and for the world to get ready for India. Right? So that was a political ambition behind it, and that's why we gave it a lot of visibility, both domestically and internationally. So to emphasize that we are an active player in the global geopolitical arena. So that is why for us it became important. But it is important for also this reason, that this is one of the few forums where G7 and BRICS come together to thrash out ideas and find a way forward to move together. Uh, yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Shreya.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for explaining it in such a comprehensive manner.
Yeah, so now I just want to take this conversation. I think the overarching explanation of G20 was extremely helpful. Um, just want to take it back to the focus of the show, which is climate and energy. So, just wondering, Prabhat, if you are able to just kind of explain, the energy and climate issues which are taking center stage, or which took center stage in India's G20, and like, is it going to be the same? Did that happen in Brazil? Is it going to be same? Like, how is the interplay of climate and energy issues and G20?
Sure. So I think one important aspect to bear in mind is that G20 does not have a permanent secretariat. Like UNFCCC, for example, or UN, they have a permanent, UNFCCC is the permanent secretariat for UNFCCC process. With G20, the host country has to create a secretariat, and then once the G20 ends, it has to wrap up the secretariat. So it's like a circus in that sense. It's constantly moving. But then what it does is, so the challenge is to ensure continuity. And plus, this is not governed, it's all voluntary, it's not governed by international law per se. So how do you ensure accountability dimension of it? So that's the tricky part, so those two are very tricky, and so it very much depends on any given country, what are its geopolitical priorities, and what does it want to move forward, and and at any given time, that what does it see as the important aspect. So so for us, in because of COVID, and because of the various supply chain constraint, we climate, and also broadly climate and energy was important, that we want to shift away from fossil fuels. So that's why it was given such an important space, significance of central space in the overall G20 agenda. But traditionally, it has been finance, the finance, like reform of international financial architecture. How do you make sure that that when we're talking of development finance, etc., that's made available to developing countries on favorable terms and etc. So even if you look at the G20 structure, there are two primary tracks. One is the finance track, which is led by the national Ministry of Finance or National Treasury, and then it has 7 to 8 working groups dealing on different aspects of finance, etc. But that's led by Finance Ministry, one single ministry. Then there is the Sherpa track, which is now led by the Ministry of External Affairs in India, DERCO in South Africa, and then it has various 15 working groups now, which are led by respective line ministries. So that becomes much more broader in that sense. So it's not, and then something like climate is not only negotiated here, but it's negotiated in UNFCCC, and UNFCCC is the forum. Now, so that creates a bit of tension that can G20 take decisions? It can agree on things, but that doesn't mean that all of the other countries will have to agree on that. So that creates a tension between the climate agenda, how it plays out in G20, and how it plays out in UNFCCC space. So thankfully for India, we had our leaders summit planned out in September, whereas COP summits take place in November, December. So we didn't have to worry about them playing side by side as it played out in Brazil this year or in Indonesia last year, right? Because then it creates like, who's going to take the decision? Is it the ministers or is it the leaders? And that creates doesn't create very helpful scenarios but whereas in our case, because we could push for ambition, we had engaged almost all countries. Everybody was keen to bring in ambition also. The tripling of renewable energy targets, including getting the phrase billions to trillions of climate finance, there was a consensus on that. And then the UAE presidency could take those things and use the next 2 months to build consensus around them in the COP process, and they could then be adopted in during those negotiations. So I think that is the dynamics. Brazil, unfortunately, from my perspective, Brazil tried to have a task force on climate. The ambition was to bring the climate and finance discussions much more closer. I think because of various reasons, it couldn't achieve those ambition in that sense, right? And task force again is not a formal, a fixed structure of the G20. So it will not be taken over by South Africa. It could have been, but South Africa, because of the political sensitivities, and you've already spent 1 year on trying to do that, you don't want to spend again and again. So that will not be part of South African agenda, but there are other avenues where climate energy remains important. And there is a lot that South Africa shares with India in terms of its energy mix. So heavy coal dependence, etc. So I mean, Sandeep, you worked with colleagues in South Africa also. So that there are similarities there, and there will be things which will see a lot of similarities compared to the Indian G20. But of course, one major difference is that under the Indian presidency, there was agreement reached to include African Union as the newest member of G20. Now, African Union has participated in the Brazilian G20 and will participate in the South African G20, and it will have much more closer dynamics with South African government. So that how that will play out, because African Union is not the biggest, like strongest economy. So that difference, how will that play out? That needs to be seen.
Prabhat, this is fascinating. Just one really like out of curiosity. Like you said, the one distinction between G20 and UNFCCC is one is like a permanent secretariat, the other it is rotational. So countries' agenda really can dominate what that G20 process could look like. But is there continuity? If a big decision has been taken, could that be rescinded because this country doesn't have that? For example, just to play devil's advocate, we had tripling of renewables as a G20 call. Could, I mean, South Africa won't do that, but let's, in a very hypothetical situation, like, could South Africa decide that we want to rescind that? Is that a possibility? And the second question I have is, when these declarations happen, there is no implementation pathway for this, or monitoring pathway, right? Or is there a way to monitor any decision that has been taken? So just to summarize, the first question is around, can major decisions be rescinded? In theory, of course, maybe nobody will do it. And the second question was around any kind of, uh, I mean, I don't want to call it monitoring, but like, the spirit is like, can you monitor like what you have declared in the previous G20s?
Sandeep, quickly on the second, let me start with the second first. So I'll give you an example. In 2009 G20, I think if you go back that far, you will find a language on fossil fuel subsidy reform, inefficient fossil fuel subsidy, and if you see the declaration, that's almost the same language keeps on repeating. And there was a phrase, in the medium term. So that was in 2009. We are sitting in 2024-25. If 15 years is not medium term, then I don't know what is medium term, right? Um, so 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 one has to, but you also have to be recognize that you have amongst G20 one of the biggest fossil fuel producers, right? Who for whom this is the question of around which their economy is based, and over time, if you look at US is now one of the biggest fossil fuel producers, right? So there are interests there which make it very hard to actually move uh, uh, in concrete terms. But so again, so South African G20 is the last country to host G20 presidency in the first cycle, right? So now what South Africa has announced is that it is going to do a review of G20 over the last 20 years. And so that question that you have asked, theoretically, that will be answered there. That what has G20 agreed to over the years? What has it done? Has it been? And so we hope that we will get some strong responses on that. And then from next year, it goes back to US for the first presidency of the next cycle. And given the domestic politics in US, we'll have to essentially see where it will go from there. That there are a lot of things that dynamics will play out. So I think that answers your second question. On the first, in this sending, look, it's not a legally, as I mentioned, it's not a legally binding convention. So in theory, you can't hold anybody to account. Because anyways, it's decision by political leadership, and leadership in a given country changes. Today it's one party government, and tomorrow it will be another. So they might just say that we don't. So for example, I mean, in this year COP 29, Argentina, on the second or third day of negotiation, called back its negotiating team because there's a new government in Argentina and they don't believe in climate science, right? So you can practically do these things, and Argentina is part of G20 also. So that has consequences for how G20 gets managed. So in theory they can listen, but practically it need not happen. You don't the you can just say you don't want to make reference to that particular aspect. You can stay silent on that particular thing. You don't have to rescind necessarily that particular thing. So that is why sometimes it's important to ensure that the same thing, even if it is no value add, fossil fuel subsidy, it is repeated again and again to at least keep it on the table.
Yeah, before I hand to Shreya, I do think that these messagings have a larger bearing. I mean, it's a very indirect thing, but I definitely can say that because India declared a net zero, it has a it provided a big framework for many people to push ambitious climate policies, without which those conversations were tough. And that the fact that tripling of renewables and all, it has a more indirect bearing. So yeah, that makes. Anyway, Shreya, over to you. I've asked a bunch of questions in the middle.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to continue on the same theme, but wanted to understand something very different. When G20 happened here in India, we got a chance, journalists like me, to look closely how this whole G20 planning works, what kind of importance even simple terms like would and could can have on the whole decision that the G20 presidency can come out with. So I am curious to understand how G20 as a platform influence climate issues, not just for the host nations or the participating nations, but in general as a global discourse. See if tripling of renewable, as we were discussing, was decided in India's G20. Then there was something around energy efficiency, etc. We are yet to see it trickle down in Indian policy making. So I wanted to understand the influence, larger influence or bearing that G20 as a platform has on specifically climate issues.
Thanks. I got the gist of the question, so I can respond to it. Look, I think so I'll contrast it with the UNFCCC process again. So UNFCCC, because it's dealing with one issue, even if it's very multifaceted issue, but and because there's a secretariat, you can go into depth, and every year you can start from the where the conversation ended last year. There's continuity, and you can go deeper and deeper. But so that's a technical in nature. That conversation is technical in nature, right? But what G20 can bring is it can indicate the political will of the lead of the 21 biggest economies in the world. It can indicate that the leadership of these countries wants to signal that this is the direction where things should go. So that is the value add that G20 brings in terms of saying that, look, we do not know how we are going to do this, but this is where we want to be. And now it's up to the various constituents, both state actors and non-state actors, to figure out how to get there. Because you can't expect the leaders to be prescriptive. You are just indicating that this is a destination or this is a direction which you want to take, and and then leave it to the technical forums or technical negotiating tracks such as UNFCCC and others to find out how to do that. Now, the flip side, I think, is also true. For example, now if you look at US, with the new administration coming in, already we are seeing a lot of banks, American banks, going back on their net zero announcements, right? So that in that sense, that the political direction and the speed at which that has to happen, that becomes important. So tripling of renewable energy, I think that indicated that we want to go there, we want to be there fast. That is the signal that comes, that and then it gives a signal to investors that this is the direction we are hoping and we are anticipating that the investment would go. So that I would say is the value add. In terms of various non-state actors, I think it provides a framework. It provides a framework of, in absence of global policy on any given thing, it gives a certain global political will that that this is if for example, if Putin and Biden can agree on this thing, then who are we to fight about this thing? I mean, that is, it, one can interpret it in that way. That if they are agreeing, in spite of their differences, if they agree on tripling of renewable energy, then why not? But then that. But then once the things change domestically, then it kind of creates avenues that and that is why we need to then again bring in the repetition. That we stick to this political direction or not.
So just taking this forward, like I think you touched upon this, but maybe we would like to just go more deeper on this. Like with the Indian G20 experience and now with the South African G20 experience, and I know the civil society works slightly differently, in both countries. Like, what role could non-state actors, civil society, play in? Do they have any influence, or could they influence in any way in making G20 more ambitious for climate? and if they could, and I'm scratching, I'm getting into your notebook, what could be some broader strategies, not asking for like nitty gritties and details, but like what kinds of issues can they raise that might have resemblance?
Okay, so I think the first aspect that we need to be really cognizant of is when we're talking of non-state actors, two aspects actually. Non-state actors, that's a lot of actors. It's from civil society to business also, right? So they all fall there. At the same time, when we are again talking of non-state actors, there are those actors who want to take strong action on climate. There are those non-state actors who do not want to take strong action on climate. And then there are those non-state actors who want to see action on elsewhere, which is not related to climate and energy. And all these actors, because G20 is very broad canvas, all these actors are at play. So it's not only one climate constituency who is at play, but there is, say, health is at play. So for example, again, going back to, if you look at non-state actor, then we are looking at the engagement groups in the G20, which is, to give you, it could be civil 20, it could be think 20, it could be business 20, youth 20, women 20, all these actors. Now, business 20, for example, in a country like South Africa, which is heavily dominated by fossil fuel, might have a very different interpretation of where South Africa should go compared to civil society, right? Now, but if you were to unpack the civil society in a country where civil society is very vocally active, such as South Africa, and we are witnessing it, and there might be struggle within the civil society as well. All these tensions and all these contestations need to play out to finally have any influence on. But the good thing about G20 is that it's not dependent on any one working group or engagement. So in that sense, it's strategic, because then you're not dependent on success or failure of any one group. You can look at 10 different working group and see that we strategize a bit, we approach it from various angles, you know and that is kind of what my role has been in this new role, to say that, look, this is, I understand the G20 structure. You don't have to obsess about any one working group only. You need to see which are the different actors, and from where all we can get the entry point, and then see, you diversify your risk in that sense, and then you see where you can get the most mileage. And accordingly, even if you might be very close to a certain constituency, but you feel that it's not going as per your objectives, then you have to be hardcore about those, and then say that, look, in the larger scheme of things, this is where ideally things should have come, but it is not happening, so let's try some other angle. So that's a strategy, that you need to be nimble footed on this thing. And then I think it's not just, it's important that there are boots on the ground, right? A lot of the time we have seen this in the Indian G20 also, witnessing this here. Trying to influence the process from afar doesn't really go much far, honestly. You have to find those who are in the domestic context, who can actually uh, do things on the ground. Without that, it won't have much influence. So, and then to find those actors, and to understand the dynamics between those actors, all that is important. And I think that's where, luckily for me, because I've lived in South Africa for 4.5 years, so that gives me an edge, because there are a lot of South Africans who know South Africa in and out, but there are very few of them who understand G20 as well. So that again speaks to the connecting the dots, kind of thing.
That's great. Just to summarize it all together, I wanted to understand from you, rather get a forecast of sorts. What are the top three or top five things to look forward to in South Africa G20 in terms of both energy transition and climate action? this is a very selfish question because my reporting depends on it.
On it. Climate and energy is not going anywhere. I mean, it is going to. Um, so yeah, I can tell you this, that in during the Indian G20 presidency, the biggest issue that was not resolved until the last was Russia Ukraine, those two paragraphs. But before that, if there was any other issue which was left unresolved to the last moment, was climate energy. So it demands that kind of attention on a regular, ongoing basis, and it's not gonna. So given the geopolitical tensions, competition, it is so your reporting is not under threat, and the resources are under threat, but not your reporting share. So, so don't worry about that. Things. I mean, if there are fires in, I mean, in December, January. If there are such big fires in northern hemisphere right now, I mean, what so but coming back to what we can expect from South Africa, I think the first is, from my perspective, the overall review of G20, and I hope that there will be something on climate and energy, that that this is what we have been promising, and whether our promises and implementation, whether they are going, whether the gap between the two is reducing or it remains the same. So that would be the one thing. Um, Second, I think on climate, I think that would be a bit of a challenge, because COP30 in Brazil will happen before the leaders summit, the G20 leaders summit. So that creates a tension, that in the sense that COP30 cannot look to the leaders for signal. It has to resolve things by themselves. But that would mean is that the best signal that can come from G20 this year is at the ministerial level, not at the leaders level. And the ministers are the same ministers which will negotiate in Triple C and G20. So I think from a technical perspective, you will not see much progress. From political, possibly, but I think the biggest gain they can do is to find a way after the COP29 outcomes, which not everybody has been happy with, to sort of find a way to rebuild some trust, or if we not rebuild the trust, not make sure that we press pause on the spiraling down of the discourse. So I mean, that is important. I can't, we can't have major breakthroughs unless there is trust re-established, and that there is, this thing that the negotiations will happen in good faith and not hold on to numbers till the last 2 days. And so all those things, the processes are important in that sense. On energy, I think so South Africa has been experimenting with what we refer to as country platform, the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, etc., all that stuff. So I think that which India hasn't engaged with, but there might be countries which are smaller than us for whom this platform might work, this kind of structure might work. So something on that what learnings from that what South Africa has done and what it has learned, etc., and what so that could be another dimension to see how do we refine these country platforms to serve the needs of the countries and not go by the donor. The other is on the finance track. I think on the finance, there has been discussion on the something called cost of capital commission. Something, I mean, the shape and form is still under a bit of a flux. But how can you make finance or lending uh, in a way that doesn't create debt traps for uh, developing countries, particularly African countries. So that will also be an important aspect. And then I think I mean for Indian Foreign Ministry now, Africa is an important partner. So from that perspective, for South Africa, enhancing the profile of African Union, that will be definitely an important avenue. And given that many African countries have a lot of resources that are critical from energy transitions perspective, I think that will be a good thing. And how the critical mineral space, and how does that unfold all those things, we can see some progress. We can expect some progress from G20 under South Africa this year, which will be of, if not direct, if not primary, then secondary consequence of how things pan out in India in that sense.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought on a lot of topics. Thanks again for this 360-degree view of the issue. We will close the conversation now. Thank you for covering all what was possible. I hope we could have talked a bit longer, but I believe we'll have you back after the South Africa G20. Yeah. But thank you again. It was a fantastic conversation, and we could not have asked for a better start for our 5th season. So thanks again for joining us, Prabhat.
And Prabhat, thank you from my side also. I really learned a lot. I'm walking out of this conversation with some really interesting ideas of what we can also do. And so thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Sandeep and Shreya. Looking forward to engaging with you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the 2 hosts at Shreya_J and at Sandeep Pai.